It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Jamila stepped into the police station. It seemed like any other day. The sun was shining outside, and the streets were busy with people coming and going. Cars honked their horns in the distance, and the usual noises of the city filled the air. But for Jamila, today felt different. There was a strange feeling, a change in the air, as if something important was about to happen. She didn't know it yet, but today would be the day her life changed forever. Jamila had always been an ordinary person to those around her. She had a quiet way about her, never seeking attention, never trying to stand out. She didn't mind it. She preferred it that way. She liked the calmness, the peace of not being noticed. But today was different. Jamila could feel it deep inside her. The feeling wasn't something she could explain, but she knew it was there. As she walked through the doors of the station, the cool air hit her face. She paused for a moment, taking in the familiar smell of coffee, old paper, and the sharp scent of cleaning products that always seemed to linger in places like this. The lights above flickered slightly, as if the building itself was alive, watching, waiting. Inside the station, the usual noise and chaos buzzed in the background. Cops shouted orders, their voices rough and firm. Phones rang with a harsh, mechanical sound echoing through the room. The sound of footsteps in every direction seemed to fill the air with a constant hum. But despite the noise, there was a tension, something that made the air feel thick, almost heavy. It wasn't just the normal chaos of the station. It was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She walked toward the front desk, trying to ignore the eyes that followed her every move. She had been in this station many times before. She had been here for small things, simple matters that didn't really matter to anyone else. But today, there was a change. Today, something was different. Jamila knew that feeling. She had felt it before, like when she was younger, and she could sense something was going to happen, but she couldn't explain it. Back then, it was just a feeling. But now, as she stood there waiting to be called in, it was more than just a feeling. It was a sense that something important, something life-changing, was about to occur. As she stood there, she felt the familiar eyes on her. People didn't really notice her. She was the quiet girl, the one who kept to herself. She didn't talk much, didn't make waves, didn't attract attention. She was used to the whispers, the sideways glances, and the way people underestimated her. They didn't know her. They didn't know who she really was. They didn't know where she came from. They didn't know the power she carried silently in the background. They didn't know what she was capable of. But one thing was for sure. The people who would soon learn about her, they wouldn't forget. Her dark eyes scanned the room as she waited. The police station wasn't anything special. It was a big, busy place filled with people who never took the time to look at the faces around them. Everyone was caught up in their own world, in their own problems. That was fine with Jamila. She didn't need attention. She didn't want it. But today, something about the way the officers were acting felt different. As she stood by the desk, a few of the officers looked up, but none of them really paid much attention. They glanced at her, but quickly looked away, continuing with their work. Jamila didn't mind. She wasn't here for anyone's approval. She was here for a reason, and she had a job to do. But the tension in the room only seemed to grow. She could feel it pressing down on her, heavy and thick, like a storm cloud waiting to burst open. Jamila couldn't help but wonder what was going on behind the scenes, who was making all this noise, and why everyone seemed so tense today. The young girl who stood next to her shifted nervously from foot to foot, glancing up at the officers and then quickly back down at the floor. Jamila noticed how everyone seemed on edge. A few cops were whispering to each other in hushed tones, casting quick glances around as if they were worried someone might overhear them. There was a sense of urgency in the air. Jamila felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around, and there was Officer Walters, a man she had seen around the station a few times. He was always quiet, usually minding his own business. Today, though, his face was grim. "Jamila," he said, his voice low. "They're ready for you." She nodded, giving him a polite smile. She didn't need to say anything. She was here for a reason. She had done this before, walked into rooms full of people who didn't know her, who didn't care about her. But today, the moment felt different. As she walked toward the back room, her mind wandered. She thought about the people in her life who had always made her feel small. The ones who had looked at her as if she didn't matter. The ones who had underestimated her. There had been so many of them. It wasn't that she minded being overlooked. It was that they didn't know her. They didn't know the strength she had inside. But today, they would find out. Today, things were going to change. Jamila felt it deep inside her. She didn't know exactly what was coming, but she knew it was something big. She could feel the building of something that was out of her control, something that would bring everything crashing down. The tension was thick in the air as she walked down the narrow hallway. Each step echoed, and the sound seemed to grow louder in her ears. She felt the weight of the moment in her chest, as if her heart was racing with each footstep. When she reached the door, she paused for just a moment, collecting her thoughts. She had no idea what she was about to walk into. But she knew she had to face it. She knew she couldn't back down. The door opened with a soft creak. Inside, the room was filled with officers sitting around a large table, their faces serious. At the head of the table sat Officer Lyle, his eyes dark and cold as he stared down at the papers in front of him. He didn't look up as she entered. It wasn't that he didn't see her, it was that he didn't care. And that, Jamila knew, was a mistake. Jamila stepped further into the room, her heart beating faster with each step. The atmosphere felt heavier, the tension palpable. She could hear her own footsteps echo on the cold, hard floor. The voices in the room seemed to dull. And for a moment, it felt like everything stopped. She could feel every eye on her, even though no one said a word. Officer Lyle was sitting at the front of the room, his back straight, his hands resting on the table in front of him. He had a sharp, cold expression, the kind that made people nervous. Jamila had seen that face before, on the faces of people who didn't think twice before putting someone down. Lyle was the kind of person who believed power came from fear. He thought that being mean, being cruel, would make others respect him. But Jamila knew better. She stood at the door for a moment longer, trying to read the room. A few officers glanced up, then quickly looked away. Some of them didn't even acknowledge her presence. They didn't seem to care about her. And that's exactly what Jamila expected. Officer Lyle finally looked up, his cold eyes scanning her from head to toe. There was no warmth in his gaze, no kindness, just judgment. His lips curled into a sneer. Well, Lyle said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The quiet girl has decided to show up. His words stung, but Jamila didn't let it show. She wasn't here for games. She wasn't here for him. She was here for a reason. And nothing would stop her from achieving what she came for. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Jamila and Lyle. It wasn't that they didn't see what was happening. It was that they didn't care. They were just there to do their jobs, and nothing more. Jamila took a deep breath and stepped forward. She didn't let the fear in her chest control her. She could feel the weight of the moment, the heaviness of the room closing in. But she knew this was the first step. She had to be strong, even if no one else believed in her. As she walked closer to the table, Lyle's expression changed slightly. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to figure her out. He didn't like it when people didn't show fear. That was his thing. His power was in the fear he could make others feel. He thought he had control, but what he didn't know was that Jamila was not afraid of him. He straightened up in his chair, leaning forward slightly. So what brings you here, Jamila? Lyle's voice was low, mocking. You don't exactly look like the type who belongs in a place like this. It was clear to her that Lyle didn't take her seriously. He saw her as weak, as nothing more than a quiet girl who could be pushed around. And for a long time, Jamila had let people think that about her. She had let them think she was just someone who kept her head down, who didn't speak up. But that wasn't who she was. It wasn't who she had ever been. "I'm here to do my job," she said quietly, but firmly. Her voice was steady, despite the tension that buzzed in the room. Lyle smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Your job?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "And what exactly is your job, Jamila?" The room fell silent, waiting for her answer. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Jamila could feel the weight of their eyes on her. She had always been the one who had kept quiet, who had stayed in the background. But now, as she stood there, it felt like she had the attention of everyone in the room. Her hands were steady, but inside, her mind was racing. She could feel the anger building up inside her. For years, she had been underestimated. For years, she had been overlooked, treated as if she didn't matter. She had been the girl who was always in the background, always out of sight. But today, she wasn't going to stay in the background. "I'm here to make sure you understand who I am," she said, her voice calm but filled with an intensity that made the officers in the room pause. Lyle's expression faltered for just a second. He didn't expect that. He didn't expect her to speak with such authority, such confidence. For a moment, there was silence. Then Lyle chuckled, a cold, humorless laugh. He thought this was some kind of game. He thought he could laugh it off and make her feel small. But Jamila wasn't here for games. She wasn't going to let him make her feel small anymore. "I don't have time for your little games, Jamila," Lyle said, his voice sharp and cruel. "I've got better things to do than waste time with someone like you." But Jamila didn't flinch. She had heard worse, seen worse. She had spent years being told she wasn't good enough, that she didn't matter. And now she was done with it. "I'm not here to play games," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'm here to show you that you made a mistake. A big one." Lyle leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What mistake?" he asked, his tone growing dangerous. Jamila held his gaze, her mind calm, her thoughts clear. She didn't need to explain herself to him. She didn't need to explain anything. She had already made her point. "The mistake of underestimating me," she said quietly. "The mistake of thinking you could get away with treating people like dirt." The room went still. The other officers didn't know what to make of it. They were used to Lyle being in control, used to him making people feel small. But there was something in Jamila's voice, something in the way she stood there, that made them realize this was different. Lyle's face twisted with anger, but he didn't say anything right away. He just stared at her, trying to figure out what to do. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. He wasn't used to someone looking him in the eye and not flinching. For the first time, he seemed unsure. Jamila didn't wait for him to respond. She wasn't here to beg for his approval. She wasn't here to apologize for who she was. She had nothing to prove to him. She turned and walked out of the room, her steps steady and strong. Behind her, the room was silent, the tension thick in the air. As she stepped back into the hallway, she took a deep breath. She had done it. She had stood up to Lyle, something that no one had ever dared to do. And for the first time, Jamila felt something she hadn't felt in years: power. The rest of the officers in the room would remember that moment. They would remember how Jamila had walked in, how she had spoken, how she had made them see her as someone not to be messed with. They would remember that she wasn't the quiet girl they thought she was. She wasn't the one to be underestimated. And that was just the beginning. Days passed, but the events in the police station lingered in Jamila's mind. It wasn't just the words spoken or the looks exchanged. It was the feeling. The feeling that something was changing. Slowly, she began to notice little things, small actions, small choices made by people around her. People she had never thought twice about before now seemed like they were moving differently. Jamila could feel it. The tension wasn't gone. It was still there, swirling in the air around her. It was in the way the officers spoke, in the way they looked at her. Something had shifted. She continued her work in silence. She did her tasks without complaint, never drawing attention to herself, but always observing. She paid attention to every conversation, every movement. She knew something was coming, something important, something that would change everything. She could feel it in her bones. One afternoon, Jamila walked into the station like she always did. Nothing unusual at first. The same noise, the same hurried voices, the same busy officers. But as she passed by the break room, she overheard something. She had been walking quickly, not intending to stop, but the conversation was so clear, she couldn't help but pause. "Did you hear? There's talk of a visitor coming to the station. Someone important," one officer said, his voice low. "Yeah, I heard. It's supposed to be a big deal, but no one's saying who it is exactly," another officer replied. "I don't know, but they said it's someone who's going to change things around here. Someone who's got power." Jamila's heart skipped a beat. Her father. The words echoed in her mind. Power. A visitor. It didn't take much to connect the dots. She had heard rumors before, rumors about her father. But she hadn't thought about them much. It had been years since she had heard any real news about him. But now it was clear. He was coming to the station. She stood there for a moment, thinking. Her father was not someone who was easily forgotten. He had a reputation that carried weight. People feared him, and for good reason. He had built something strong, something powerful. Jamila had always known that. It was in her blood, her history, but she had never let it define her. She had always stayed out of the spotlight. She had lived her life quietly, not drawing attention. But now, with the news of his visit, everything was different. The world around her felt like it was moving faster. The tension was thick. Jamila knew she had to be careful. She had to think carefully about how to handle this. The next few days were a blur. She went about her usual tasks, but her mind was elsewhere. It wasn't just the anticipation of her father's visit that had her on edge. It was the way the officers had been acting. She noticed the way they whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. She noticed how they seemed to move around her with more caution, more respect. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were treating her differently, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. There were whispers in the halls. Her name, her father's name. Jamila overheard more conversations, short sentences, hushed voices. No one said anything directly to her, but it didn't matter. She could tell they were talking about her. She could feel their eyes on her. The respect, the caution, the fear, it was all there. But she kept her head down. She focused on her work. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. Not yet. Not until she was ready. Then, one morning, as she walked into the break room for a quick coffee, she overheard another conversation that made her stop in her tracks. It was Officer Lyle's voice, loud and unmistakable. "I don't know what's going on with her," Lyle was saying, his tone filled with disdain. "She thinks she can just walk in here and act like she owns the place, like we're supposed to be scared of her or something." Jamila paused. Her heart raced, but she didn't let it show. She knew Lyle had never liked her. He had always looked down on her, treated her like she was nothing. But hearing him talk like this, like she was some kind of threat, it made something inside her stir. She wasn't sure whether to be angry or to laugh. Lyle clearly didn't understand what was happening. He didn't understand that things were changing, that she was changing. He didn't know the half of it. As she stood there, listening to Lyle's rant, she realized something. He was scared, scared of what was coming, scared of the change. She could hear it in his voice. The anger, the frustration. It was all because he knew, deep down, that things were about to shift. And he wasn't ready for it. "Don't worry about it," one of the other officers said, trying to calm him down. "You're just letting her get to you. She's nobody. She's just a girl. She's not worth your time." But Lyle didn't seem to be listening. He was too focused on Jamila, on the way she had stood up to him before, on the way the room had gone quiet when she spoke. She had made an impact, and he didn't like it. Jamila turned around and left the break room before anyone could notice her. She didn't need to hear any more. She had already learned what she needed to know. Lyle was scared. The others were scared. They didn't know what to expect from her, and that made them uneasy. But she wasn't scared. She wasn't scared of him. She wasn't scared of any of them. She was ready. That evening, she went home and sat in her small apartment, thinking about everything that had happened. She thought about her father, about the rumors that had been swirling around the station. She thought about the way things were changing, how the officers looked at her now, how they treated her differently, how they were starting to fear her. But there was still so much she didn't know, so much that hadn't been revealed yet. Her father was coming. But what did that mean for her? What was he going to do when he arrived? She didn't know. She wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But she knew one thing for certain. When he came, everything would change. The days leading up to her father's arrival were long and filled with tension. Jamila could feel the world around her shifting. The station felt different now. The officers who had once ignored her, who had treated her like she was invisible, were suddenly paying attention. They looked at her differently now. There was a sense of wariness in their eyes, a kind of respect she hadn't earned, but one that had been given to her because of something they couldn't quite understand. It was as if the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Even the air felt heavier, thicker, as if it, too, knew that change was coming. Jamila didn't let any of this distract her. She kept her focus, kept to herself. But inside, she was more certain than ever that the moment her father walked through those doors, everything would change. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not now. Not when everything was on the edge of breaking. The morning of her father's arrival arrived with an unusual calm. The station was quieter than usual. Officers were moving around, but there was an air of anticipation. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for the visitor. No one was sure who it would be, but they all knew one thing. Someone important was coming. Someone who could change everything. Jamila walked into the station as she always did, her expression calm, her movements slow and deliberate. She could feel the eyes on her, but she didn't let it show. She wasn't there to answer questions. She wasn't there to explain herself. She was there to wait for her father, the man whose name had been whispered about for years, the man whose shadow still loomed over everyone in that building. She had grown up hearing stories about him. Her father was a man of power, of influence. He didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. His actions, his reputation, his history, those were the things that people feared. And Jamila had always known that, even when she was young. She had always known that one day his past would catch up to him, and it would change everything. But what Jamila didn't know, what no one could have prepared her for, was the way the station would react when her father finally stepped inside. She had always lived in his shadow, always known that his influence was something that shaped everything around her. But now, as the moment approached, she realized that she had been preparing for this day in a way she hadn't fully understood. As Jamila sat at her desk, she noticed that the officers seemed more on edge than usual. They weren't speaking to each other the way they normally did. They weren't making jokes or laughing or sharing the usual small talk. There was a tense silence in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. It didn't take long for the door to open. The room went quiet instantly. Jamila didn't even need to look up. She could feel the change in the room. She could feel the presence of someone powerful, someone who commanded respect without saying a word. She stood up slowly and turned toward the door. The man who stepped inside was tall, his posture straight, his face serious. His eyes scanned the room, taking in everything, everyone. The officers, the ones who had always seemed so confident, so in control, were now looking at him with wide eyes. Jamila's father had arrived. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Jamila's heart raced. It had been years since she had seen him, but she knew him. She knew the way he moved, the way he stood, the way his presence filled the room. She had spent her whole life hearing about him, knowing that one day he would come for her. And now, here he was, standing in the very same station where she had been working for years. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Her father's eyes moved around the room, finally landing on Jamila. For a brief second, their gazes locked. There was no need for words. They both understood. The officers, however, didn't understand. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it. They could feel the weight of his gaze, the power that seemed to emanate from him. They looked at each other, unsure of what to do. And then, Jamila's father spoke. "Is this the station where my daughter has been working?" His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable power in it, a force that made the room go still. The officer closest to him nodded, too scared to speak. Jamila's father looked around the room again, his eyes sharp, as if he was assessing everything in sight. "I've heard a lot about this place," he continued, his voice like a low rumble. "But what I've heard about my daughter is what matters now." The room was silent. No one dared speak. No one dared move. The officers stood frozen, like they were caught in a moment of uncertainty, unsure of how to act, unsure of how to respond. Jamila could see it now. Her father's presence had done exactly what she had hoped it would. It had shattered the illusion of control. The officers who had once treated her like she was invisible, like she didn't matter, were now seeing her in a different light. They were seeing her through the lens of who her father was. They were realizing just how wrong they had been about her. Jamila's father turned toward her, his eyes softening for the first time since he entered the room. "You've done well, Jamila," he said quietly, his voice gentle. "I'm proud of you." Jamila felt a rush of emotions, but she didn't let it show. She had prepared herself for this moment, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure what to feel. There was relief, yes, but there was also something else. Something deeper. Her father didn't need to say anything else. His presence, his words, his authority were enough. The officers in the room now understood who Jamila was. They understood that she wasn't just some quiet, unnoticed girl. They understood that she had been waiting for this moment. And they realized, too late, that they had underestimated her. As Jamila's father spoke, his voice filled the room, making it clear that things were changing. The power dynamics in this building were shifting. The officers who had once looked down on Jamila were now realizing that they were the ones who had been in the wrong, and they would have to answer for it. Jamila's father made his way to the front of the room, and as he did, the officers began to move aside, giving him space. They didn't say a word, but they didn't have to. Their silence spoke volumes. They knew that this was his domain now. Jamila stayed in the back of the room, watching. She wasn't the one who needed to speak anymore. Her father had come, and with him, he had brought the weight of his influence. Jamila had always known that one day things would change, but she had never realized just how quickly everything would shift. The air in the room was thick with silence. Jamila's father had made his presence known, and it was clear that things were no longer the same. The officers who had once looked down on her were now shifting in their seats, uneasy and unsure. They had been wrong about her. And now, they were seeing the truth. Jamila could feel the change in the room. The power had shifted, and it wasn't just because of her father. It was because of the strength that she had found within herself. She had always been quiet, always stayed in the background. But now she stood tall. She stood next to her father, who had always been a figure of authority. And as they both stood there, the weight of their combined presence was undeniable. Her father's eyes moved over the officers, taking in each one. They were nervous now, shifting in their seats, avoiding his gaze. They knew, deep down, that they had underestimated Jamila. They had thought she was just another person they could ignore, another person they could push around. But they were wrong. She was so much more than that. And now, they would have to deal with the consequences of their actions. Her father turned to Jamila, his face softening for a moment. There was a pride in his eyes, a recognition of her strength. He had always known she was capable, but seeing her stand up for herself, Seeing her face the fear and the tension head-on made him proud. He knew that this moment was more than just about her. It was about everyone who had ever looked down on her, who had ever treated her like she didn't matter. "It's time for them to learn," her father said quietly, his voice filled with authority. Jamila nodded, her heart beating faster. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. She had waited for this moment for so long. She had been patient, she had kept her head down, and she had watched. But now she would take control of her own destiny. And she would make sure the people who had wronged her, who had wronged so many others, would finally be held accountable. Her father stepped forward, and the officers, who had once been so confident, now stood at attention. They knew who he was. They knew what he was capable of. And they knew that this was not a man to be trifled with. One of the officers, a man who had always been quick to make cruel jokes about Jamila, stood up, trying to regain some semblance of control. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Sir," he began, his words faltering. We didn't know. You didn't know." Her father's voice was calm, but it was filled with an undeniable power that made the officer stop in his tracks. "You didn't know. You didn't know who she was. You didn't know what you were dealing with." The officer stood frozen, unable to speak. He had been one of the loudest voices, the one who had always made Jamila feel small. And now, in front of her father, in front of everyone, he had nothing to say. The silence in the room was deafening. Jamila felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She wasn't happy to see the officer cower. She didn't take pleasure in his fear. But she knew, deep down, that this was necessary. This was the moment when the truth had to come to light. She wasn't just the quiet girl who kept her head down. She was someone who deserved respect. And today, she would make sure everyone saw that. Her father turned to the rest of the officers, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You've all treated her like she was invisible. You've all treated her like she didn't matter. But let me make something clear." His voice grew stronger, more commanding. "She is not invisible. She never was. And she will not be disrespected any longer." Jamila's heart swelled with pride. For the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged. She wasn't the outsider anymore. She wasn't the one who had to hide. She wasn't the one who had to watch from the sidelines. She was in control now. She was the one who had the power. Her father continued, his words filled with authority. "From now on, things are going to change. The way you treat people, the way you treat Jamila, and the way you treat anyone who walks through these doors will change. I will make sure of it." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. They had always been used to doing things their way. They had always been used to throwing their weight around, to making people feel small. But now, they were being forced to confront their own actions, and they didn't know how to react. Jamila stepped forward, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "I don't need anyone to feel sorry for me," she said, her words strong and clear. "I don't need anyone to apologize. What I need is respect. What I need is for you to understand that I am not someone you can walk over. I am not someone who is weak, and I won't stand for anyone treating me like I don't matter." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. The officers were silent, their eyes wide. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to respond. But Jamila didn't need them to say anything. She had already said everything she needed to say, and she knew that from this moment on, nothing would be the same. Her father nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "You've done well, Jamila," he said quietly. "You've shown them who you are." And in that moment, Jamila knew that everything had changed. She wasn't just the quiet girl anymore. She wasn't the one who had to hide. She wasn't the one who had to be afraid. She was someone who had earned the respect of everyone in that room, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. The officers left the room, one by one, their heads down, their eyes averted. They had been defeated, not by Jamila or her father, but by their own actions. They had shown their true colors, and now they had to face the consequences. Jamila stood there, her father by her side, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she had finally found her place in the world. She was no longer the person who was overlooked. She was no longer the person who was invisible. She was the person who had the power. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The police station had grown quieter after her father left. It was almost as if the building itself was taking a breath, exhaling the tension that had lingered in the air for so long. Jamila sat in her small office, alone but not lonely. She had come a long way since the days when she was overlooked, when she was invisible to the world around her. Now, everyone knew who she was. Everyone knew her name. And while it wasn't always easy, and it didn't come without challenges, Jamila felt a sense of peace in the quiet that followed the storm. She wasn't the same person she had been. She had learned, she had grown, and she had fought for her place in the world. She looked out the window of her office, watching as the sun began to set. The city was bustling outside, but the station felt like a different world now. The shift that had taken place wasn't just because of her father's arrival. It was because of the strength she had found within herself. She had always known she had power, but it had taken years of silence, of watching, of waiting, before she truly realized what she could do. The world didn't give respect freely. It didn't always recognize strength when it was quiet and unseen. But Jamila had learned that sometimes you had to make your own way. You had to carve out your place, no matter how hard it seemed. She had learned that true power wasn't about forcing people to notice you. It was about standing firm in who you were, no matter what. And now she knew that the respect she had earned wasn't just given to her by others. It was something she had fought for. Every moment of silence, every time she had been overlooked, every time someone had assumed she was weak, it had all led her to this point. She wasn't just the girl who had been underestimated. She was the woman who had taken control of her own destiny. Jamila stood up and walked over to the window. She could see the officers in the parking lot, some of them still talking in hushed tones, still trying to process what had happened. But Jamila knew that the real change had already taken place. It had happened the moment she had stepped into that room and made them see her for who she truly was. It had happened the moment her father had walked in. But it had been her actions, her words, that had made the difference. She had finally found her voice. But it wasn't just about the respect of the officers. It was about something deeper. It was about understanding her own worth. It was about realizing that she had never needed anyone else to define her. She had always been capable, always been strong, but now she had the confidence to show it. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "You've done well, Jamila." He had always believed in her, even when she hadn't fully believed in herself. He had always seen the potential in her, even when she had doubted her own abilities. And now she understood. She understood what he had meant all those years. Jamila smiled to herself. She had always known her father was a man of power, a man whose name carried weight. But today, she had realized that the power wasn't just his. It was theirs together. She had stood by him, yes, but it was her actions that had made the most difference. It was her quiet strength, her resilience, that had been the catalyst for change. As the evening wore on, Jamila sat back down at her desk, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. She knew that the journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead. There would still be people who doubted her, people who tried to put her back in the background. But she also knew that she was no longer the person who would let that happen. She had faced the fear, faced the doubts, and she had come out stronger for it. Jamila knew that life wasn't about waiting for things to happen. It was about taking control, about standing up for yourself and for others. It was about refusing to let anyone tell you that you didn't matter. She had learned that the quietest person in the room often held the most power. And it wasn't just about who you were, but about how you chose to show the world who you were. As she sat there in the quiet of the station, Jamila felt a sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from avoiding conflict or from staying hidden in the shadows. It was the peace that came from knowing who you were, knowing that you had earned your place in the world, and knowing that no one could take that away from you. She had fought for her voice, for her place, and for the respect she deserved. And now she was ready for whatever came next, because Jamila knew one thing for sure: she would never be invisible again.